Today's show is sponsored by Do It. Cloud spend is just the surface. What really matters is how it drives performance, reliability, and speed to market. Do It Cloud Intelligence aligns every dollar to the intent of the workloads. Do It is trusted by companies like Fiverr, HackerRank, Current, and Superbet. Do It helps teams go beyond dashboards, surfacing hidden inefficiencies, resolving incidents faster, and aligning cloud operations with business priorities. One platform, unified signals, better outcomes across engineering and finance. Visit doit.com, that's DOIT.com, to unlock intent-aware FinOps at scale. Do It Cloud Intelligence.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. Another weekend perspective here in the early part of September. And I'm thinking a little bit, I mentioned it on the sort of Cloud and AI News of the Month. They brought it up as a comment as we were talking about sort of just business models around AI, all the funding that is kind of flowing into this. And, you know, some of the early revenue numbers we're seeing, but also some of the early just massive amounts of capital it requires to compete in this business, or at least build something in this business that seems to be somewhat differentiated. And it got me thinking, and again, I keep going back to these sort of long podcasts I have as I listen to it on road trips. Had another 1,000-mile road trip again this weekend, so had some time to kind of go back and listen again, kind of review, rehash some of these things. But thought it'd be interesting to dive in a little bit as to, is there, do we expect to see, or, could we see sort of a repeat of some of the business models that emerged in the cloud era for, some of the transitions that we're seeing? So I'm going to kind of frame this really kind of around Apple and Google and Android, but in terms of sort of consumer behavior, consumer business models, consumers' opportunities, and so forth, and see if there is any parallels between, what's going on, let's say with OpenAI and some others, and the opportunity for anybody to sort of crack in and break through and sort of make a name for themselves in this space. So we're going to get to that right after the break. Today's show is brought to you by TestCube. Are flaky tests slowing your Kubernetes deployments? TestCube powers continuous cloud-native testing directly inside your Kubernetes clusters. Seamlessly integrate your existing testing tools, scale effortlessly, and release software faster and safer than ever. Stop chasing bugs in production. Start preventing them with TestCube. Check it out at testcube.io/cloudcast. And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, I wanted to dig into kind of this thing I had in my notes that I called, where is the Android of AI? And so the framing of this, the way I was thinking about this was, if we think about the transition to mobile as mobile was beginning, and again, mobile, I'll frame, somewhat is sort of smartphone mobile, not necessarily like the early, BlackBerry type of mobile, or even sort of the Nokia flip phone sort of stuff, the stuff that didn't really give you a screen, didn't do what we think of as a modern smartphone. It really was just sort of a telephone that had very, very rudimentary, very poor, it would be completely unusable internet in today's world. But if we think about the context of that, so Apple comes along, and Apple essentially is bringing a laptop into the mobile era. They are able to, basically take 15 years of Mac development and the work they had done, in learning about the iPod, how to miniaturize things, how to begin to start to do that. But really, what was interesting is they essentially had a model that was going to be a premium model. So it was going to be, they were going to own every aspect of it, from the hardware to the software to the carrier that you could buy it from. They got into some subsidization with the carriers in terms of that. It eventually became something the carriers were paying them for, because it was generating so much data and so much traffic on their network and so much stickiness to affinity for the phone and so forth. So on one hand, you had this new business model come along. In terms of the phone, eventually the pricing of the phone started to come down, but it was a very data centric application. Right, it was very, very different than everything we had thought of with the phone before, where you bought a calling plan and you bought a number of minutes and maybe a number of text messages. We were now getting into sort of these sort of unlimited types of things. And again, it wasn't exactly like that when we began, but very much the Apple approach was a very premium product, very vertically integrated, sort of one vendor and controlled the entire thing, as well as eventually how it was expanded upon through the App Store, and then being able to take a revenue cut from all of the revenue that came from any transactions through the App Store. So that was sort of their business model. And because of the uniqueness of the experience, it was something that the carriers were heavily incentivized to want to be part of. And obviously, Apple eventually, was highly incentivized to continue to build this very premium type of product, right? So that was one approach to things. And the second approach that came along was, we think about it as Android, but really the second approach was an opportunity for Microsoft to take what they were doing around mobile, and they had done some things in previous situations, but their business model was very much built around the idea of selling operating systems, and so their initial foray into mobile was very much going to the carriers and saying, "Hey, I have an alternative to Apple. It's going to be a lower price thing. We understand how to work with a broad ecosystem of hardware vendors, as we've done with the operating system in the past. So we're going to be able to work with tons and tons of different phone manufacturers. That's going to allow you to have different price points for the phone, but there was going to be a cost that Microsoft was going to impose on the carriers for a per operating system type of thing." And so they were very much trying to replicate the play that they had done with Windows, and eventually sort of the add-ons for Office and so forth. And there was a possibility this took off. And then Google came along. I'm trying to think what the time frame was in this, because I have an interesting backstory that someday I might share on the show. I have a sort of an interesting connection to where the Android business model, not necessarily Android, but the Android business model came from. Kind of crazy, like what if scenario. But anyways, so Google comes along and they go, "Hey, what if we gave you the operating system for free?" So undercutting the price point of Microsoft, and also we will make it open source so that you can have certain levels of control. And so this was very much in contrast to what Apple was bringing in terms of openness, in terms of flexibility of the hardware that it would support, in terms of freeness of the the operating system itself. And so from a carrier perspective, they sort of looked at this as like, "Oh, okay, wow, we're going to be getting very, very good technology at a low price point. We'll be able to offer alternatives to Apple to the broader set of the market." And the only thing that in their mind they believed they had to give up was that it had to use the default the default Google services, so things like Maps, search in particular, which again was going to lead them to be able to do mobile advertising. And fast forward, we all sort of know what happened. Android has not necessarily in any way become the number one revenue generator in terms of the phone. Apple has dominant control over that. It essentially made their business, but their ability to get the Google search bar, essentially Google search and the applications as the default into billions of people's hands, was a completely different business model, completely different way of subsidizing the exact same service with something that they were able to monetize at a far greater rate than they subsidized it, right? And so hence, it created essentially a duopoly of business models for this transformative technology. And so what I've been thinking about, for a while now, especially as we go through, Cloud News of the Month and AI News of the Month, and all the announcements that are happening, and sort of, some of the revenue numbers that are coming out for an OpenAI, for example, but also, some of the other players in this space. And I really start to, kind of wonder, am I thinking about this correctly in terms of, will there be an alternative? Because right now the approach that everybody sort of seems to be taking is some sort of per user, per seat license on a subscription basis, annually, monthly, whatever it is. They've kind of gotten away from the idea that anybody's going to understand fully exactly which model they have. I mean, there is a set of super users who really do understand what a advanced reasoning model looks like versus a flash model or something else. People really don't understand, for the most part. Again, this is an even thinner slice of the sort of super user, understand what a token is, or what millions of tokens look like, or the difference between reasoning models, the number of tokens versus a regular query. So they're going to have to get to some sort of pricing model that the average person can understand. And so then the question becomes, right now, I guess the general perception is that somebody like OpenAI, who is the early market leader, has early market adoption, 10, 12, $15 billion of revenue, short of $1 billion of user or a billion number of end users, is sort of in the position of an Apple, sort of, in the sense that they're sort of first mover with the very different technology, differentiated technology. They sort of have defined what the user experience looks like to some extent, right, for some use cases. But they don't have nearly the sort of vertical integration that that Apple had, right? And this is why we're seeing OpenAI consistently going out and looking for funding. We saw Sam Altman make a comment this last week that they're going to need an extra, I think, $80 billion of funding in order to be able to just keep up with what they expect their demand is going to be over the next 3 or 4 years. So by no means do they have sort of the vertical integration that Apple did. They are renting data centers from all sorts of people, whether it's Google or Microsoft. They don't necessarily own their GPUs; they're renting the GPUs. You see them out, doing these gigantic potential projects again through different funding partners and so forth. So they sort of have a portion of it as the premium model and the per seat model similar to Apple. They by no means have the vertical integration similar to Apple. And then you think, and they very much, are pushing back, at least for now, against the idea of sort of an advertising driven model, although that has proven to be the most profit generating model in internet history, whether it's Google or Facebook and Meta, or whether it's Amazon, or whether it's plenty of other companies who have driven their monetization through advertising, right? So we have this sort of fragmented starting point that doesn't necessarily look exactly like what we saw at the beginning of mobile. In cloud, cloud was very much a fully vertically integrated model, right? Amazon, AWS, for example, it was all Amazon services in the Amazon cloud. Eventually over time they opened up Marketplace and they opened up, doing sort of Amazon in your data center. But again, that's never been the core of their business. Their business was really just, pure usage basis. And so, it doesn't feel like we have sort of a repeating model here. In the cloud, the followers, the people that followed the Googles and the Azures and so forth, basically just replicated Microsoft's model because the people that were buying it understood that Amazon's model, the AWS model, looked sort of like what you did with IT. Like that's a server, that's storage, those are network bits, that's a firewall. They didn't quite understand all the concepts of like per hour billing and reserved instances and all that kind of stuff. They eventually started to understand this, but they never really had to create some sort of like completely different concept that they had to understand. So I guess where it sort of leaves me with an AI perspective is we're sort of stuck between multiple business models. We've got the one, which is, the OpenAI one that people sort of point to and go, well, they're sort of leading. They are leading in terms of number of users. They are leading in terms of more or less leading in terms of revenue generated, at least as best we can tell, because everybody seems to be sort of fudging numbers as to, what's exactly right. But they also seem to be leading and burning through cash and needing to take new and greater rounds of funding, further diluting their ownership of the business, further diluting their ability to sort of dictate what the business does. And they have right now no sort of functional way of doing advertising, even as a baseline for what they do. So that leaves us with the leader with this sort of fragmented, unprecedented business model, which doesn't necessarily at this point look to be profitable into any time into the future. And then the alternative becomes what, right? The alternative becomes, is there a way to, I guess the question becomes like, let's suppose there was an Android of AI, right? Would that look like sort of what Android looked like, in which you said, well, I will subsidize essentially the entire industry. I will subsidize the most important elements of that part of the industry in a way that will be even more profitable through advertising, through sort of access to go-to-market, access to searches, access to information. Is there a way to sort of do that in the AI space? So in essence, that would be sort of commoditizing or giving away access to the model, but also to a certain extent, how do you democratize that? Because you can't really give away access to the GPUs, right? Like it's not like you're not selling a phone in this case, right? The GPUs really make the most sense when they're more or less centralized so that you can build gigantic clusters, you can train at very large scale, you can do inference at low cost and so forth. And we really haven't seen anything near that today. We haven't seen even an NVIDIA who could, who makes the chips. I'm sure has huge markups on the chips. I'd have to look what their profit margins are, but I'm sure they're very, very high given their market share and their sort of dominance in the marketplace. Even we haven't seen them offer a service on top of their own capability, which they could essentially subsidize through some other mechanism, right? Even like they haven't figured out, for example, how to offer NVIDIA GPUs that they own because they make far bigger profits selling them to people, but they could offer their own service for some sliver of that. And then maybe they partner with somebody like Google or somebody like Meta. But the hard part is those are some of their biggest customers, but also, you only have to go about one step or two steps removed from that to go, well, that's also their biggest competitors, right? Google is making their own TPUs. Google obviously has vast resources in the model building space and has vast resources in bringing AI to lots of other things. So there isn't necessarily like a natural advertising partner for NVIDIA. I'm sure somebody could figure out how to do it, and maybe there is an upstart that's coming along, although where they would find the amount of data to be able to create advertising at the scale that Meta and Google does would be kind of hard to find. Maybe it's an Alibaba or somebody, one of the Asian or Chinese companies who has that sort of level of data. Maybe it's a TikTok or somebody along those lines. But it just feels like we haven't yet begun to sort of see the legs stretch out for what an alternative business model yet looks like, given just the vast amount of resources, CapEx, space, power, cooling, access to GPUs, access to data scientists, to where this is an alternative profitable business to a business today in somebody like OpenAI that isn't necessarily profitable at doing this. And so it does feel like a very strange situation. It feels like we're simply kind of watching the technology evolve. We continue to be sort of amazed at what it can do. It does continue to get more intelligent. Whether it's getting cheaper or not, it really kind of depends on how you do the math and what you're kind of looking at. It's tough when you don't really have vast amounts of competition beyond NVIDIA at the hardware level, which we're not used to seeing. We saw vast hardware competition in mobile devices. We've seen vast hardware competitions in CPUs and hardware boxes. We just haven't really seen it beyond NVIDIA. They're sort of the king of the pick and axe kind of the hardware people, the infrastructure people of this. So it leaves us in sort of an interesting position in that we're watching the technology be very interesting and compelling to people. It is very unknown as to whether or not it can be profitable or drive enough value to be like ROI positive, right? So for an end user, as opposed to just thinking about the model makers or the cloud providers. And so it puts us in an interesting situation. It feels, somewhat, I guess, more like the 1999, 1998, 2000, 2001 internet, in which there was a lot of really interesting ideas going on, a lot of technology happened, but the early people in this didn't find a business model that worked, and eventually they got themselves so levered up with debt and other things that a couple of bad quarters and some things happened, and it was all sort of fell over on them, and then eventually, sort of out of those ashes, rose the phoenix that became the new version of the internet that we all use today. And so you do have to wonder, just given kind of where we are. And I come back to the analogy of saying, is there going to be an Android of AI? Maybe that's the wrong analogy. Maybe it's, is there going to be, something beyond the WorldCom of AI or the MCI of AI or, any of those sorts of things. It'll be interesting to watch. It just right now, as I think about it and I talk through it and I try and rationalize it in multiple dimensions, it is increasingly harder to figure out what the breakthrough will be to a profitable business model, such that people can get access to this technology, which they have the ability to get access to it. It's just, can they get access to it at a price point that is both profitable for the providers and sustainable for the people that need it to turn it into other business ideas. And so, I keep coming back to wondering, am I too hung up in the past thinking about previous business models? Maybe that's the blind spot in my way of thinking about it. And I'm, absolutely fully of the belief that might be the case. But I just haven't yet seen sort of an inkling of what the alternative business models might look like. And I know people sort of always default to saying, well, it's agents, right? It's people are going to pay for, a $20,000 agent that can do what a $200,000 employee can do, or a $20,000 agent that can do what 10 $200,000 employees can do. And maybe that is the case. But, then the thing becomes like, well, okay, how many $20,000, I guess you could do the math, right? How many $20,000 agents do you have to sell and, make them as capable as $200,000 people who probably are college degrees, 10 years of a trade, 15 years of a trade, an MBA, advanced degree, an advanced, sort of medical degree, advanced law degree. It'd be interesting to sort of walk through what the math is of that, because it's not just the collective of 100 or 1,000 $20 per person things. It is, it has to have a specialty, and then it has to be managed accordingly. And we don't yet know what that sort of looks like. We just sort of throw the word agent at things. So anyways, I'll wrap it up there. I'd be very curious for anybody who's been doing sort of some thinking about this as to, where do you see this evolving? And I ask in the context of not, where exactly the technology goes, because we could always see the evolution of, the price point of GPUs coming down, an alternative in hardware architecture that can do similar types of things to GPUs that could help, essentially build the neural networks for these LLMs. Maybe it is a incredibly interesting, novel new way of building these LLMs such that they're really more like small language models, and could, what they could do on 20 GPUs, you can now do on one, right? All those sort of permutations are potentially out there at some point in time. But then the question becomes, who's going to pay for it? What are their consumers going to pay for it? And will there be an ability, as we saw with, the network effects that happened with having a mobile phone, the network effects of being on the internet, networks effects of being part of social media networks that in many cases cost people very, very little amounts of money? Can we see that happen in the AI space, right? Especially in the consumer AI space. So anyways, would love to hear your thoughts. Would love to hear, what you're thinking about in this space. Creative ideas, potential ideas, all those sort of things would be kind of cool to hear. So anyways, that'll wrap it up. Thank you all for listening. And thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for helping us grow the show. It's been, we've seen another sort of big jump up in listenership here recently. So we're very thankful for that. And we appreciate that. And trying to do the best we can. And again, apologize for these sometimes going out late. A lot of travel recently, and I got a lot of travel coming before the end of the year. So we're going to be working very hard to keep getting these out on Sundays and Wednesdays as always. But apologize if they come out a little later than they expect on a regular Sunday. So with that, I'll wrap it up, and we'll talk next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.